And we're live. I've really been looking forward to this. Welcome, Donald.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to it too.
So I should warn everybody about a couple of things. One is we tend to jump right in, so I'll kind of set the table, so to speak, and but we'll get right into it. The other thing I should mention is that although we're going to mention Donald's book here, we're going to be talking about some of his conference presentations, at least as much as the book. And it's worth noting it's because we were both at TDWI Orlando just a couple of weeks ago, and I had the rare privilege of sitting in for a couple of days because we often teach on the same day, so we don't always get that opportunity. So fair to say that most of your career, Donald, has been on the product side with a particular emphasis on BI.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I've always been building products ever since I started in my career. I started building analytic products, first of all, in the kind of science and academic space, and then moved into industry, and then moved into more generic things like data warehousing, and then some time at Microsoft building business intelligence analytic tools, some time at Qlik building their next generation tools. So yeah, primarily I've been a product guy most of my career.
Yeah, and that's that's really going to be our focus. Although we're both very curious about all things data, so I'm sure the conversation will go down a couple of tangents. But that's going to be our focus. Everybody is kind of on the data science BI aspect of things. So since we had this opportunity to spend some time together, I've heard a couple of your favorite anecdotes about data, and there's one in particular that I wanted to ask about. Data governance has been a theme. This is the third of these that we've done, and data governance was a substantial chunk of the first one that we did with Jonathan Reichenthal, and you were sharing a metaphor at the conference that involved your grandkids in data governance, and I found it very charming on multiple levels. So I was hoping we could kick off by you sharing that.
Sure. Yes. What does my 5-year-old granddaughter have to do with data governance?
Yeah,
Exactly. She's 5-year-old at the weekend, so it's not quite 5-year-old yet. But yeah, what does she have to do with data governance? Well, when the granddaughters are visiting us, and our house is a bit chaotic, as you can probably see behind, there's lots of stuff everywhere. And when you've got young children visiting, you have to make the house safe for them. You have to put bumpers on the edge of the furniture, and you move all the breakables out of the way. And you do this so that that grandchildren are going to run around like crazy. If you didn't do that, then you'd be constantly intervening, constantly saying, oh, don't touch that, constantly running over and trying to stop them. But because you make the space safe for them, then they can largely do what they want. And they can run around and they can be as free and as happy as they want to be. And the important comparison that I make of that with data governance is that far too often our approach to data governance is the trying to prevent things as they're happening. We see data governance as a protective and negative capability. We go in and we stop bad things happening. But actually, if we take a proactive approach to data governance and we create a safe space for analysts to work in, then we actually give them more freedom, more independence, more creativity, more joy in their work, because they're then free to do things knowing that the space is safe for them, and therefore they can largely do what they want, and they can be innovative and free-spirited within that space. So I actually think it's a pretty reasonable analogy. Either you run around trying to prevent bad things happening as they're happening, which is an impossible task, or you prepare the space, you prepare the data estate in such a way that analysts can give free rein to their creativity and innovation, knowing that the space is well governed. I think if you do that, then better things happen, and it's better all around.
Well, I like the metaphor on multiple levels, but it also reminds me of a different kind of metaphor for something I think quite similar. And Cal El Dubaib, who you know quite well, who runs our data science and AI team, and I'm a member of his team here at Further. There's a phrase we've been using at conferences quite a bit. We talk about having breaks so that you can go faster. And it's the same kind of thing. If you've got guardrails or AI governance into place, then you're more relaxed to try to focus on the solution. And I think there are some similarities between the two.
I think that's a great metaphor. I think it's what they have in common, which I think is very important, is that we shouldn't see governance as a negative constraining capability. Governance done properly is actually an enabling function. And far too often we've thought of governance and the administration of data and management of data as being a negative function rather than an enabling function. The other phrase I use a lot is that we need to stop being gatekeepers and become shopkeepers. We need to think about our function as being enabling people to do things. If we prepare the data well, if we make it fit for purpose, if we make it easy to consume and welcoming, then that's a better process than trying to be gatekeepers, of constantly trying to keep people out and control the process.
I like that. I like that metaphor too. I want to pause for a second to greet folks. So we're on the StreamYard platform right now, which basically means that if you're joining us on YouTube or on LinkedIn or what have you, all your comments gather here. So I would love to get some comments about who has joined in from where. That's always very interesting indeed. So feel free to start letting us know that. Also, we're going to keep this very conversational, but I have a number of things that I planned that I want to ask Donald about. But with probably a good 15 or 20 minutes to go, want to turn our attention to audience questions, if at all possible. So if you have questions, it's not too soon to put those in the chat, but we'll really start to turn our attention to that closer towards the end. So let's spend just a little bit more on data governance. Could you elaborate a bit on the kind of behaviors that you're trying to encourage? So from the employee standpoint, what are you hoping that they'll do in this environment that you create for them?
Yeah, so there's really three things I think we need from an employee who's working in analytics in a well-governed environment. The first is that they should be free to explore. And they should have curiosity. Curiosity is a really important thing. Curiosity enables people to make discoveries that they wouldn't have made before, but it also enables them to be ready for doing particular kind of analytics that they may not even know they need to do today. If you just start dealing with standardized reports and so on, and standardized dashboards, then you're really going over the same old hypotheses again and again and again. And then something happens. It can be a natural disaster that affects you. It could be a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal that disrupts the entire global supply chain. Are you ready for that? Are you ready for the kind of analytics, the kind of ad hoc investigation that you need to be able to do? You can only do that if you've practiced. You can only do that if you've been used to exploring and experimenting in that safe environment. So that's the first thing. I want exploration and experimentation. The second thing that I'd want to come out of this is collaboration. That is the ability to share insights and the ability to work collaboratively towards new insights. So rather than focusing, say, on the individual analyst and their ability to work and do specialized work, we would hope that people can collaborate more and have a kind of shared approach to discovery and a shared approach to analysis. And then the third thing that would come out of that, both from the exploration and the collaboration, would be innovation. The ability to not only make new discoveries in the data, but actually be able to drive new directions in the business or within the organization based on the analysis that you've been doing. In other words, what we're looking for is an analytics-driven, innovative business to come out at the end of this. So exploration and curiosity, collaboration, and from that, innovation and analytics-driven innovation in particular.
Yeah, you reminded me of I'd be curious to get your reaction to this, at the risk of it being a digression, because it's an example of the curiosity that you mentioned. I was on a gig, and to be clear, this was 10 years ago, so it wasn't. I'm not describing any current further clients in any way, because it was a lack of curiosity I'm about to describe. We were looking at bank transactions and how frequently folks did various things like present themselves in front of a teller, which is obviously more costly than going to an ATM, and we look in those kinds of things. And we found that there was an unusual pattern in checking balances. There was a bell curve shaped around the kind of number you'd expect each time month, half dozen times or something like that. But then there was a spike again at really big numbers, like 900 or 1,000. And somebody on the team speculated that it could be an app, actually, that's just pinging this, like the apps that many of us have on the phone now, but that would be less common, 10 or 12 years ago. And when we talked to the client team about it, they said, "Oh, just throw those out. Those can't be interesting. That's just very, very nervous customers or something like that.
Right.
That's the kind of thing I imagine that you would hope an employee would bring to the data team, not just ignore.
Yeah, and there's exactly that. There's you think of a spike in the data like that, and it could actually be something very interesting. It could be people who are continuously checking their app because, for example, they're expecting a payment,
Yeah.
and who then may well, thinking in product guy terms, may therefore really appreciate a feature such as a notification. And not necessarily having notifications all the time, but let's put a notification in to say when a particularly large check has dropped into your account, something like that. And so you could absolutely turn something like that is precisely the fact that that's an unusual behavior, which should make you interested in it and could potentially lead to a new feature, which would be valuable for your application, rather than saying, oh, it's an outlier, let's ignore it, which is the uncurious approach to these things.
Yeah, I found it profoundly uncurious, that kind of instance.
Right.
And who knows what direction that would take you, right? So we've talked a bit about employees throughout the organization and the kinds of things we'd want them to encourage. Let's take a moment and talk about senior management. So what do you see? I saw that reaction, Donald. So you mentioned during the conference that you enjoy sitting in on board meetings or other senior management meetings when you get the opportunity. What kinds of behaviors do you see, among the senior management tier, and what would you like to see more of?
Yeah, I do like doing this. This is a peculiarity, if you like, but it came from originally doing some research in product research in particular. And I was very, very interested in how people made business decisions with the products that I was designing. And we were interested in all sorts of different scenarios, including how do people collaboratively make decisions in boardrooms, for example. And so I developed, and I don't want to call it a technique, but a practice, if you like, of asking clients, can I sit in on your decision-making processes? And I'm not going to interfere in any way. I'm just going to observe. And nowadays, this is a little bit easier to do because so many of these meetings might be on Zoom and I can record them. But actually, if you're in a room, it's fascinating to be able to do this because you can see much more of the body language and interactions. And what I do is I simply watch a decision-making meeting, and it could be something like a quarterly business review or a monthly sales meeting, or it could be something more strategic, like an annual board meeting. And I watch and make careful note of how data is used in the meeting and how people orient their decisions around data. And I'm going to say that rather than how decisions are driven by data, because it turns out that people don't drive their decisions by data. They orient their decisions around data, but they're not necessarily driven by them. And the difference is that right at the beginning of the meeting or right at the beginning of a section or a topic that's up for discussion, an agenda topic, data will be presented on the screen. We've probably all seen this. Big dashboard will go up. Sometimes it's just a spreadsheet, but often it's a dashboard report and it's up on screen. Everybody can look at it. Somebody makes some important points about it. There may even be some data storytelling, if that's good, explaining something around the data that we're seeing and the implications of that data. And then the conversation drifts into, okay, what does this mean and what are we going to do about it? And at that point, the data is abandoned and left behind. Because if the conversation is about, sales of refrigerators in Western region are down and sales in refrigerators in Eastern region are up, the response to that rarely is couched in data terms. Nobody really comes back and says, well, I've got the data that shows why, or I've got the data that counters that view, and actually things are a little different. It all actually drifts off into anecdote. And the conversation becomes, our salespeople in the West region are newer than in the Eastern region, so we're not making more sales, or the weather was different and people weren't in the mood for buying refrigerators, or there's competition on the West Coast that there isn't on the East Coast, or the weather, it could be almost anything, the macroeconomy or whatever it is. But that conversation is never supported by data. That conversation is all anecdotal. And whether the marketing campaign is good or the salespeople are good or there's external factors becomes an anecdotal conversation. So we start off with the intention of being driven by data and we end up with anecdote. And this happens just frequently. I see this very, very often. And even in companies which want to be data-driven, I tend to use this phrase, to become data-oriented rather than data-driven. That is, they start with the data, the conversation starts off about the data, but it soon drifts off into unsupported anecdotal conversations. And there's some good reasons for that, but it's still very clearly the pattern. And when I record that, when I make note of it and can play that back or can present that back to teams, they're often very shocked at how little of the data they actually used in their conversation, or how little data was used. Data is presented at the beginning, but they very soon drift off.
I want to stay on this for a couple minutes, because when I heard you first mention this, and I found it very interesting indeed, and it resonates with my experience too, but I haven't given myself too many opportunities to have the exact experience that you described. So that's the sense in which it was both resonating and saying, wow, that's on one level not that surprising, but also, again, I haven't had that exact experience. I wonder if we could ponder for a bit about why this is happening. So they're starting with data, and my guess is it's because they've got some picture, some illustration, some story about a KPI or something like that, because that's what they're going to be focused on. I mean, on one level, appropriately so. Hopefully they've chosen appropriate KPIs, so they should be focused on them. But therefore, since KPIs are important and all those other things, that those work their way into the dashboard. Someone noticed a disappointing number in the dashboard. Do you think I'm right about that? But that's why they get that far with data. But why do you think so few organizations go the next step and look at the data for the solution?
Sure. Well, so one important point is, yes, you're right. They're primarily thinking about metrics that drive their business. So there will be a metric, there'll be a KPI that they are focused on, and there'll be one or two which tend to dominate the conversation. Now, we used to say, I still say it in the data world, that every data problem is really a metadata problem. What comes up in this conversation is, well, what does that number really mean? If it says sales are down, what's a sale? And that might seem like very philosophical, but it's really not, because if I'm comparing, say, sales in Western region, Eastern region, say, yeah, sales are down, but actually leads are up, and we've got longer sales cycle, and so we haven't made so many sales, we're actually expecting more, and the sales we do have are more profitable, whatever. How is that number made up? And very often your KPI is just this oversimplified number. It's just a number, one number that you've decided represents, this area of performance of your business, which is great at the time of setting it up. But when you start to have questions about it, when you start to debate it, now you need a way of understanding how that KPI is created. What is the history of it, how it's constructed, and what does it really mean in business terms? And that's where the so-called single version of the truth actually becomes much more complicated, because there are very different viewpoints that can be brought to bear on that. And that's where the conversation really starts.
Oh, that reminds me actually of another one of the stories you told about data being fit for purpose, the outliers and the fraud thing. But the story that I'm talking about. No one else does, so we'll find a way to work our way over to that. But what I was going to say is, KPIs have to be pretty straightforward, right? Because otherwise,
right, it's their purpose.
But what you're saying is that's in a sense where things start to unravel, because there's somewhat famously Goodhart's law, right? Once you have this target,
they become oversimplified,
But also, if you've agreed upon how to strip away the data or how to process the data to calculate the KPI, that same process is removing certain data points that might reveal interesting problems. So it's almost, I hadn't thought about it this way before, but it's almost like focusing too much on KPIs can fight with curiosity, right?
Well, absolutely, yeah.
KPIs have to be agreed upon, and so I think I've created a little bit of a segue to that, the story that you told about the fit for purpose, because some of it might be going on now if I remember the story, which others are going to hear in a moment. You basically were going through a data cleaning process that was not unlike a KPI calculation, but the process of doing so removed some data that was very important in answering a different question.
So that's really important. So there are two. I think there's two elements to this story, and well, let's tell the story first, and then we'll talk about the elements that come from it. People will wonder what on earth we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I did work on a project. It was a very large project for a banking service that was providing credit cards for the bank, but also providing credit cards for stores. So if you went into a store, like a hardware store or clothing store, food retailer, and you took their credit card and their store card, then essentially that's backed by a bank and issued by a bank. And so this bank had its own cards, and it had a wide range of store cards as well that it provided. And this was quite a long time ago. This is further back than your 10-year-old story. So we're really dragging them out today. But this was back in the day when, first of all, if your cards might not swipe properly, people would even get out the old paper credit card machine, using carbon paper, and would run the card through a machine in order to take a reading of it. And therefore, by the way, that card payment wouldn't appear on your account for several days because it's a mechanical process it was going through. Yeah. Or if it did go through a card reader, those card readers frequently dropped. People might not have enough credit on the card stripe might not read properly. They might need to split the transaction between two cards. There's all sorts of things could go wrong. And then at the end of the day, whether all that data could be reliably uploaded to the store and then reliably uploaded into the data warehouse was another thing. So the data was a mess. There was a lot of data, but it was a mess in many different ways. And trying to build an analysis of that in particular, the marketing and the product department, who was defining and designing new data products, what they wanted was a clean analysis so that they could see spending patterns and things. So we spent a lot of time building this project. It took a long time to analyze all the different data sources and the types of data quality problems they have. And it took a long time to build the ETL data quality processes to clean them up. And then when we'd actually designed these processes back in the day, it took a long time to run them. You remember these ETL processes that took 8 or 10 hours to run, if you were lucky, if there was nothing wrong with them. And so they had branching and error correction and all sorts of things. And so at 6 o'clock in the evening, these processes kick off. And if you're lucky, 6 o'clock in the morning, the analysts have a data warehouse that's clean for them to work with. And so we did this. We spent months building the project, or helping to build the project. We spent hours every night cleaning this data through a complex ETL process. But the result was a data warehouse that was clean and effective and gave really high quality analysis for the product and marketing people. Great. And then along came the fraud department and said, well, you've spent all this money building a data warehouse. We'd love to do some investigation of patterns of fraud and invalid spending and people who are potentially having problems with their accounts. We would love to look at this, and what we need to see is all the invalid transactions, all the failed transactions, all the inaccurate swipes, all the late arriving swipes, all the duplicates, all the dropped, all the missing data. From that, we'll find the patterns of fraud. In other words, the work that we had spent months designing out and hours every day operating out was exactly the data they wanted to see. That was exactly the data that was fit for purpose for fraud detection. Now, that was the data that was getting in the way of the sales, marketing, and product analysis. So that if we think of data quality, what's the definition of data quality? If data quality is data that is fit for purpose, then the data in the warehouse was fit for purpose it was good quality for analysis. It was terrible quality for the fraud department. And it's not even an extreme example. It's a fairly typical example of having two contradictory use cases that demand different qualities of data. Now, I said there's two things that you could take from this. And one of them is this important question that data has to be fit for purpose. And that might not be the same purpose. So the idea that we have a single version of the truth isn't necessarily true. We have a version of the truth which is fit for a particular purpose. That's really important. The second thing we can take away from that is that when it comes to the work that we do in products of trying to understand use cases and trying to understand users, we actually need to understand not only what are they trying to achieve with the data, what are they trying to build, but how may that change over time? And in particular, and this is something which as a product designer, I've always had to bear in mind, it's not just what somebody tells you they want today. that's important, but how the very fact that they're using your product and therefore becoming more analytical and more insightful means that in the future they'll have other questions to ask. And are you leading them in that direction so that you will be able to answer these future questions that they're able to ask precisely because they have developed a set of analytic skills and analytic insights from using the analytic ecosystem today. So it's complex to define data quality and fitness for purpose, but this is also a continually moving target.
I want to follow up on this. I have something in particular in mind, but I want to pause for a second to do a little bit of housekeeping. So I want to mention the newsletter, and you had a very nice comment about the newsletter, Donald, when you saw it come out, because of course it was about your material and your books, and I really urge you to check that out, everybody, because it's a very simple system that we have. We do a newsletter before our thought leadership interview, and we do one after. And the one before draws upon the work of our guest, books, conference speaking, and so on. And again, I had a lovely time sitting in on your conference speaking. So you have information in the newsletter that you're not hearing about now, and that you wouldn't even be able to find in Donald's book. You'd have to. Next one is February in Vegas, if you want to possibly catch. I think you're doing part of that material again in Vegas, if I remember right. But you certainly want to do that. We encourage you to do it. And then we always do a newsletter episode after our thought leadership interview with what we think were, some of the highlights. But there's another reason why you definitely want to check out the newsletter, and that's because all the upcoming events throughout further live events and so on are all in there, including, let me see, one of the things that's coming up is the Ohio X Summit, which is going to be amazing. Now that's in person in Ohio, but it's going to be a remarkable event, and Further's going to have a substantial presence there. Marie, I think we have a graphic on the Ohio X, don't we? Yes, that's the one, and look at the date, everybody. It's coming up soon. So if you're in the Midwest, please do check that out. That's going to be a really amazing event. Until I met Cal and joined Pandata, and now Further through acquisition, I knew that Cleveland was a hotspot for a lot of this stuff, but I really just didn't know the depth of AI talent in Ohio until I started making trips to Cleveland. But it's really remarkable. In fact, I'm a little bit embarrassed that I didn't know more about it 2 years ago. So if you're anywhere near Ohio, we urge you to head out that way. Okay, so here's my follow-up. Obviously, we don't have the ching-ching credit card, almost like that mimeograph ink. I know, obviously, I've experienced that. And that kind of system would be completely inconsistent with the college student who's probably in line at Starbucks double-checking that they have the $6.50 necessary, or do they have to switch to a different card or whatever, right? That anyone who's in that mindset would not work in that environment, because this stuff it's more like writing a check, right, when it's done by paper like that. But let's modernize it a little bit, because all the things that you were talking about, I think, are still true, and I'm sure you would agree. So kind of what's the equivalent of this? And I think part of it is why we have data lakes, and then we get into things that get a little bit trendy, like lake houses and all that kind of stuff. But as you know, we talk about these kinds of things at TWI, all the time. And I think part of it is that, try as one might, to be able to satisfy the curiosity and to be able to explore the way you've been encouraging us to, you're going to have ad hoc requests of one kind or another. I remember working for a client organization at one point, again, quite a few years ago, when they said, our goal is to get ad hoc requests down to nothing, right? Everything is going to be in a pre-designed report, right? And
that's awful.
As a data scientist, I was befuddled. I just didn't know how to reply. That idea apparently lasted 6 months. They learn the error of their ways, right? But you are much more a data warehouse guy than I am. My understanding is one of the reasons we have data lakes is because data scientists, generally speaking, aren't, in fact, almost never in my experience, are working from predefined reports. because they are the team members typically that go to look at the outliers and the frauds and those kinds of things. I mean, that's certainly how I've spent most of my time looking at data in my career. So what's kind of the modern equivalent of that? What's the struggle between trying to do some data cleaning at the enterprise level, and then on the other hand, it being impossible to anticipate ad hoc needs?
Yeah, let's think about the difference between a data lake and a data warehouse. And I don't mean architecturally. I mean architecturally, you could talk about the table structures and the loading processes and the storage and all that sort of thing, and it would all be super interesting. But there's actually a business difference between a warehouse and a lake that is very important, and that is that the warehouse is not just a store of data. It's not just something that you load all your data into so that it's there for storage and at some point you may use it. When you load data into a data warehouse, the loading process involves structure. It involves conforming data to a schema, and that schema is a logical representation of a business model. We are describing how the business functions. So when you take your sales data and you load it into a warehouse and it has a time dimension, that is a description of how you see time in your business. And different businesses see time in different ways. And if you have a geography dimension, that's the way in which you see your business being organized by geography. And your geography, for example, may be really important to be structured in one way for the finance department, who have to worry about local sales taxes and things like that. And the marketing department, who might be marketing across state boundaries or even national boundaries, they have a different way of looking at geography because they think of it as being, they think of geographies in quite different way. They might say, oh, well, we're marketing to Hispanic speakers, whoever they happen to be, across different states, while the finance department has to worry about the difference between tax rates in Texas and New Mexico. So there are different ways of looking at these geographies, but what's really important is each of these ways is structured, and each of these ways is a prescriptive way of looking at the business. This is how we believe the business is. So that's what a warehouse really is. It's not just about the storage, it's about applying this business structure to it. And a lake isn't like that. And the lake house is this weird hybrid, but the lake is about, well, the data is here in a way that we can ask these ad hoc experiments about it, and we can investigate it, and we don't know what we're going to ask at any one point, and we may even be imagining different constructs. What if we organized our business differently? What if we what if we pulled out of the Arizona market? And what if we marketed in a different way? And those experimental questions require data which is not conformed to a structure, precisely because you want to be able to ask these new questions. So fundamentally, the lake enables a different kind of analysis. And it is very much the kind of analysis that will be done by data scientists, for example. But other people can look at it, especially now as we get into the world of AI and start looking at a broader kind of variety of data, even for regular business analytics. But still, that's the fundamental difference between a structured process and a process which enables more free-form exploration. Does that make sense?
It does. It does indeed. In fact, it reminds me of something that I'm quite sure you were talking about at the conference, and you just mentioned now too about time. Because I'm a predictive analytics, machine learning, AI guy. So when I sit down with a client, I'm usually trying to help the client figure out something that they're going to predict. And one of the things that I always ask them, and they typically aren't expecting this question. I'm not trying to stump them. It's just it's how I unravel what I have to do for them. Is to ask, okay, well, once you get that prediction, how much time do you need to, respond? So if it's credit card fraud, the answer is probably like right away, right? But if it's lead scoring, it might be the next time an email goes out or something like that. And it gets to kind of this rhythm of the business. And you were talking about that as well. So how does that kind of pace or rhythm of the business come into play with the same issue that we've been talking about, but also through the lens of like dashboards? Because I would imagine as a follow-up, dashboards are generally built on data warehouse, not on the data lake, because that's part of that whole discussion about structure, right?
Precisely. Yeah, this is such an important question, such an important question, because one of the things I hear all the time from people, and you hear it anecdotally from many people, it's become almost a watchword in our business, is that people are overwhelmed with data. And there's too much data, and you hear all sorts of phrases, tsunamis of data, and so on. People are drowning in data. Primarily, what is happening is that people have more data than they need to make the decisions. But very often, there's a push to get real-time data. We need to get our data more and more quickly, more and more with bring the latency down, right down to kind of sub-second kind of data sourcing. But the problem with that is precisely the question that you raised, which was how quickly can you respond? And my very strong belief is that the rate in which people see data updated and the way in which the analysis is structured to give time information has to be tuned to their rate of decision making. How quickly can they respond to it? Now, you know where I'm going to go with this, because I had an anecdote about my granddaughters earlier. So now I have to have an anecdote about my son. And my son works in the whiskey business. He's a distiller. And he makes very, 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 very high quality whiskey. And some of the blends that Matthew works on are going to be 60-year, 50-year blends. I mean, that's a very long-term process. Now, if that whiskey's sitting in the warehouse and it's maturing in a cask and it's going to be bottled in 60 years' time, what kind of decisions do you make about that when it comes to things like temperature and humidity and so on? Well, at some point they may decide that it's overall too hot or it's overall too cold and things need to be moved around or the humidity is wrong. That's one type of decision. He does not need to see that information every second, every half second. On the other hand, they of course have fire sensors and temperature sensors and flood sensors and things like that. And if there's a flood or if there's a fire, they need to be able to respond to that very, very quickly. And so that information does need to be, if not sub-second, then certainly very regularly. Or when they're bottling the whiskey and the whiskey is going into the bottles, they're filling several bottles a minute with whiskey which may well sell at $800 or thousands of dollars a bottle, then they would need to be able to respond very, very quickly to any anomalies in the production line. So they don't want to wait years for that alarm to go off. They need to get that information very, very quickly so they can respond to it. If they got that information at the wrong speed, and if they got the information about the whiskey which is in the warehouse at the wrong speed, in other words, they got it too quickly, or they got the bottling information too slowly, both of these would be completely disconnected from reality. And a lot of the time that we are dealing with data, the update of KPIs is a really good example of that. Getting it faster doesn't help you in any way at all unless you can respond more quickly to it. So the rhythm of the business really has to be tuned to the data, and the data has to be tuned to the rhythm of the business so that you can, otherwise you just get stressed and pressured by the fact that the data is changing more quickly than you can respond to. In fact, by the time you have responded to it, it might have changed back anyway. If things have happened. So you have to be careful about that as well. So that's really, really important, is understanding the rhythm of the business and the speed of your response, which is what should actually drive the availability of the data.
Well, yeah, it's the pace at which you respond to it. And then you mention the other aspect as well, but just to underscore it, how quickly the input variables are changing. So for instance, two very different projects come to mind. I've worked on manufacturing IoT data, on an assembly line. It wasn't making whiskey, but similar, actually very similar to the whiskey bottling. It's an ongoing project, so I won't elaborate, but other one might be something like student retention in a higher ed environment.
Right.
It makes absolutely zero sense to calculate the risk that a student is going to drop out every minute.
Right. Yeah.
When there's nothing about that student that that's changing every minute. It's probably, even something like attendance, if you were fortunate enough to have that kind of granularity, you might know each night. So it is just pointless to calculate a new propensity score any more frequently than that. And I think we've probably both been in conversations where there's a near obsession with real time and you raise a fairly straightforward issue like this, like how often does the data change, or what's your response time? And it's the first time it's come up in conversation, and it's kind of remarkable. But I guess it's just the issue sometimes of focusing on data and technology and not on the business problem. And
Right,
that's been
exactly.
out for a long time. Yeah. So I want to ask you about a diagram. And we don't normally do slides here, but I want to. We're going to put a slide up here, and I warned you in advance that we were going to be asking about this. Okay. So very simple. There's nothing particularly complicated about this, but I found myself thinking about it a lot. And as you know, I've been doing this kind of work for decades, but there are a couple of things that fell into place when I looked at this. So maybe you could describe it, but before you do, I'm just going to set the stage with the question, which is you made a comment about how well, first you could kind of describe the three of them, but the just so you know what's coming, the question that I want to ask you is, why is it that it's hard to support strategic decisions with BI? Because I thought that was a brilliant observation. And then the other question I want to ask you is, would you generally agree that your career has been focused on tactical? You said as much at TDWI, but somebody like me, I think you know enough about the kind of work that I've done, is more at the operational end. In that, in a sense, that's one way of describing the difference between BI and predictive analytics.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's I think that's all fair. Let's start with the explaining what the diagram shows. And I should say that, I use this diagram in my course, and I quite often, it's just like the second or third slide that I show. And depending on the audience, we can get diverted onto this diagram and talk about it for hours and spend an entire morning sometimes talking about the implications of what we're seeing here. So I think it's a very simple diagram, but but thank you for recognizing that I think there's a lot behind it. So the axes here are pretty straightforward. We're talking about decisions. And the vertical axis is simply the number of decisions that are taken, let's say, in the course of business. And I'm not going to give a time period, but it could be in a day, and it could be in a quarter or whatever. But essentially, the number of decisions which are taken in the course of business. And the horizontal axis, going off to the right, is the business value of the decision. So what we have, for example, here is, think of an operational decision. And an operational decision would be an alarm's going off. What do I do about that alarm? Or the humidity of this sample is higher than it should be. What do I do about that on a production line? And that's an operational decision. There will be many of those in the course of a day. Which customer do I call next? What discount do I offer them? There will be many of them in the course of business. But the value of each decision is relatively small. However, in aggregate, they are your business. That's you doing business. You're answering all these operational questions continuously. So you have a very high number of decisions, but each one is a relatively low value in itself.
Yeah. So let me just a second, because some folks call that kind of thing a micro decision. In fact, when I saw you speaking, I searched that because we're going to be interviewing Tom Davenport and Ian Barkin next month. And we're going to be talking about their book, so the Data Citizens, and you know that we'll be talking about that soon enough. But when I was searching for someone that had an article where somebody that I could quote about micro decisions, I happened to come across one of Tom's HBR articles from some time ago.
Yeah.
That's where I've always lived, because at first glance, when folks look at it, it's down on the low value side of the diagram. So some folks might think, oh my gosh, I have to be doing strategic, not operational. But in the aggregate, we can be talking a really big number. And I threw out an example, memorable example from returning a rental car, where I'm in this thunderstorm and I'm distracted and I'm rushing to get to the airport. And because it's a rental, I pulled up to the gas pump on the wrong side, because it was the opposite side from my personal vehicle. And then I had to turn the car around and swipe the card again. And now my card doesn't work, because 2 swipes in a short period of time at a gas station is a fraud alert, right? So I had to use a different card and eventually call customer service. That's the kind of thing you're thinking of as operational, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think micro decision is a fair way of talking about that. And worth contrasting with the strategic decision, which are relatively rare but a very, very large value. So, which new product do we launch? Do we buy this company? Do we enter a new market? Do we exit a market? Do we close offices? Do we close stores? Do we open new stores? These decisions are, each one of them is much higher value, of strategic value to the company, but we don't make that many of them. They're not even made on a daily basis. They're made on a quarterly basis, for example, within a strategy meeting. Now, the way in which this curve works is that data, and as we're primarily talking about data in this conversation, data at the operational level is micro decision level is very, very focused on that decision. It's enough data to make that decision. How much data do you need to make a strategic decision? It's a very, very large amount of data, but it's also highly aggregated. It's been because nobody's going to look at every individual transaction. The head of American Express is not that interested in Keith's problem at the gas pump. But if everybody's having that problem, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
So it gets aggregated up. So
well, like
there's
it was
more
1.7% of transactions. That's like the building's on fire. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So we start with a
fascinating comment that I want to follow up on, which is, obviously, as someone that's helped build BI tools and BI related products, and you've been in that space for many years, I'm sure you aspire to producing a product that senior management is going to value and want to use. But having said that, you made this comment that strategic BI is really hard to pull off. And I was hoping you could just
So you're right. I mean, everybody wants to kind of move up the value chain, if you want, for various reasons. But it's very sticky if you can do that. But it is really difficult to support strategic decisions because there are so many inputs to them. There is so much data, it's so diverse, and there are so many inputs. After all, if you are making a decision about which stores are we going to close or which new stores are we going to open, you're going to base that not only on internal data about that you've collected from your sales system. You also have to take into account competitive intelligence that you will have collected about the industry. You'll need to take into account demographic information about the geography, macroeconomic information about national trends, and so on. And some of that may be available in the form of data, maybe available literally in tables and so on, which could be brought in. You could build a kind of spreadsheet or a dashboard and do a calculation, but a lot of it is going to be very like what we talked about at the beginning. It's going to be anecdotal. It's going to be your gut feel about where the industry is going. It's going to be what you've heard. It's going to be what you've seen that comes into it. So rather like that conversation in the boardroom where we start with data, and the conversation is data-oriented rather than data-driven. And so that is why it's been really difficult to build BI to support that, because no matter how much data you start with, and no matter how good the analysis, it's going to drift off into other conversations, which are not data-driven, which are driven by instinct and emotion and gut feel and contradiction and all sorts of other kind of components that feed into that.
Well, picture like a CEO of a huge company like Delta. I happen to fly on Delta a lot during COVID. I'm sure there were conversations of just that CEO with the CEO of, let's say, KLM, one of their partners, right? And that's not going to work its way into a dashboard, but that conversation absolutely would shed light on some kind of strategic decision about how are they going to time, the number of flights they're going to do and how they're going to do, all that kind of thing.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I have no doubt that there was a lot of data involved in that decision, but it's not like the CEO of Delta pressed F9 on their spreadsheet, refreshed their spreadsheet and said, let's buy KLM rather than US Airways. That's not how it works. There's a lot more that goes into these decisions. So that's why it's been really difficult to support them.
So I've never had this exact conversation with my colleague, Cal, but I bet if he was here, he would probably think along similar lines. Looking back at my career, and I think his as well, operational has been really, really important to us. For instance, another phrase that Cal loves is "let's make AI boring," right?
Yes,
and what he really means by that, right? Of course, Cal, you'll hear this at some point.
He does not do a good job of that, by the way.
I'm sure he'll put his own spin on it. If he's not listening to this now, he will at some point. But what he really means by that is focus on operational, because focus on stuff that's core to the business right? These kind of routinized tasks, and that's the sense in which they're not exciting, but in the aggregate, they have a huge amount of value. So for instance, quite a few years ago, I was on a insurance fraud. It was about staged accidents, and my colleagues and I on the project are pretty sure that that was 8-figure ROI, right? But it was this kind of routinized, every claim would go through this model kind of a thing. So I've really spent my whole career on the operational side. You described at the TDWI event that kind of the sweet spot you think for BI, and it's probably been the focus of your career, has been the tactical in the middle. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure, and this is absolutely right. When I was working in predictive analytics and doing data mining at Microsoft, we were focused very much on the operational decision making, recommendation engines, things like that. Anomaly detection. But when we were working on BI and business intelligence, we're primarily focused on the aggregation of operational decisions. So you're talking about what the manager looks at, what the regional manager looks at, what the district manager looks at, what the person who's somewhat higher in the hierarchy. Typical business intelligence is targeted towards typical middle managers, and that's it's taking data which has been aggregated up and multiple data sources, and then used to make decisions which will be pushed back down to then influence the decision making, the operational micro decision making. While operational decision making, micro decision making is primarily focused on the data source that's applicable for a single decision at a point in time, and therefore much more narrowly focused. So our work in doing data aggregation, data analysis, and in the data warehousing world, the BI, the dashboarding world, is primarily dealing with aggregated data at that tactical level in the middle of the curve.
So what kind of roles are we talking about? We're talking about a manager of a distribution center, a VP of sales in charge of the Northeast, or those kinds of things. These are the folks that are making those tactical decisions.
Exactly. Somebody's whose decisions will be decomposed into micro decisions for other people. So in other words, somebody who is influencing the decisions of other people. And, that's really interesting, because if you look at people like Gartner have said for many years that business intelligence and analytics really haven't reached more than about 30% of the addressable market. And that number has not changed a great deal. The addressable market has grown dramatically because more companies are doing business intelligence. But in fact, that number of about 30% penetration hasn't changed. But what if that number is right? What if we are talking about analytics which serve the needs of middle decision makers, and you look at the span of influence of managers in, say, US business, perhaps only 30% of people need business intelligence, because they're the only ones who need the analytic decisions which are then going to influence others. So maybe that 30% number is actually pretty close to what it needs to be.
If it's tactical decisions driven by middle managers, yeah, that number, that Venn diagram could overlap. Maybe within the sweet spot of the Venn diagram, the number is actually a lot higher than 30%. It may be a higher percentage of the relevant folks. I think that's very insightful. Okay, so here it is. It's November 14th as we record this. Because of the holidays, we are doing the next event on December 4th. Feels like it's right around the corner, but that's going to be Ian Barkin and Tom Davenport talking about their book. I'm embarrassed. I can't hold up the book right now. I have it downstairs in hardcover, but we're going to be talking about the whole citizen movement. So I want to ask you about, here it is to remind folks, embedded analytics, because I think there's a bit of a parallel there. They're absolutely different topics, but there's a little piece of those two that seems to overlap to me. So I would love to have an audience question, everybody, and now is the best time to ask. So if you have a question out there, please put it in the chat. Now is the time, because we only have a few minutes left. But I want to ask you about what I see as a parallel. So in looking over your book and kind of setting up embedded analytics, and perhaps you could define it briefly when you answer, but it definitely gets at this issue that not everybody has the skill set. to do data science, let's say, right? So people have been struggling with this forever, and people talk about democratizing access to data and so on. But so we have this one element, not everybody in the organization is a data scientist. Then we have this other problem of bandwidth, right? Where the data team, you rolled your eyes when I was explaining that there was a client organization trying to eliminate ad hoc reports and requests because it just can't possibly work, right? But we also know that data teams are overburdened with ad hoc requests. So now you're really stuck, right? You've got somebody that is curious about the data. They want to engage in the behaviors that you're trying to get folks to do more of. But maybe they don't have the skill set. Maybe they don't have a license to the technology. Maybe the queue for ad hoc reports is too late, right? So embedded analytics is possibly one way to address that. The citizen data scientist it's certainly a very different thing, but it's possibly addressing the same need. Is that just because I've been reading your book and their book at the same time, or am I?
Yeah, possibly so. I'm highly skeptical of the citizen approach, and if we had another hour, we could maybe get into that. But so they are trying to address one particular problem, which is how do you get the information needed to support decisions into the hands of the people making decisions, rather than that information being highly centralized so that people need to go to one place to get the information. How do you decentralize the information down to decision makers? And a really, really good thing that we can do with embedded analytics is put analytics inside the applications that people are actually using. So if you're in a call center and you are taking calls all the time, you don't have time to go and do analysis. But if you've got an indicator, a KPI there telling you how many calls you're answering, what the quality of those calls are, whether you're on target for whatever it is you're doing in terms of maybe you're doing sales, maybe you're doing customer support, maybe you're doing upselling, but you've got some KPIs there embedded inside the application you're using, then you're not distracted by the analytics, you're informed by the analytics. So from that point of view, embedded analytics is very powerful for giving the information at the right time in the right format to the people who need it to make better decisions. I think the citizen movement is a little different in the sense that what it's saying is rather than having analytic capabilities and data science capabilities centralized, by giving people the right tools, those can be distributed and therefore democratized through the organization. Very briefly, my skepticism about that is my experience with self-service business intelligence and with self-service analytics in general, is that while it takes away centralization from, say, an IT department, what you end up with is pockets of expertise, which are just as siloed, and both in terms of technology and people and data, which are just as dysfunctional as a highly centralized system. Because you're not, unless you enable collaboration, fundamentally collaborative processes, all you're really doing is fracturing the centralized system rather than genuinely democratizing it.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely going to ask about collaboration, because when I think about this topic, that's one of the things that I think of, is that if someone spots a trend like the near 1,000 credit balance checks by one individual in a month, right? If someone spots that because they are using their access to the data through tools like we've been talking about, not creating their own analysis necessarily, but noticing that there's an outlier, if that information then finds its way to the data science team and gets considered as something that possibly should be looked at. Now, I'm not saying that you can't also have some individuals take it maybe one step further, but I wouldn't want them working independently. I'd want those folks to know about each other, and that will absolutely be one of the questions that I'll ask them. We're not out of questions. We are out of time. I want to thank Arsalan for his comment a moment ago as well. So I want to thank you, Donald, and I want to encourage everybody. So there are two things I would love for you to do right now. Click on the event on December 4th, because then you get a reminder in the feed. It's really simple. There's not a registration step. You just click on attend. So I would love to have you to just open up another browser window and do that right now. And if you're following me or following Donald or following Cal for that matter, you should be following further because there's so much interesting stuff happening every month. That's going to be the best way to stay on top of things. We have some really interesting stuff coming early in the year. We're going to be doing healthcare analytics as one. We don't have a date. We haven't created the event, and I want to lock it in with the guest. But AI ethics and healthcare analytics are both around the corner, which I think will be very interesting indeed. And of course, subscribe to the newsletter because we'll have information about this conversation in there along with upcoming events. So again, Donald, I want to thank you. I enjoyed that very much.
Cool. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.